The figure we will be talking about today is named Zhuangzi, Z-H-U-A-N-G-Z-I, and in the alternate, and again, older romanization, this is the same figure that used to be spelled C-H-U-A-N-G-T-Z-U. You, of course, don't need to know that. I simply mention it because that other name has sort of made it into the English lexicon, and based upon the older spelling, it's often been mispronounced as Zhuangzi. So if you have heard the name Zhuangzi, that's actually a mispronunciation of, indeed, the figure we're talking about today, Zhuangzi. Same person, just the spelling we now use looks a lot more like it was actually pronounced. So this is the same person. He is the third of the so-called Taoists that we are reading in this class. We first read the Laozi, then the Inward Training. We are now turning to the Zhuangzi. As we mentioned, and here I want to underline because it becomes all the more important today, Taoism is a later retrospective school. None of these thinkers were thinking of themselves as being part of a school called Taoism, and that's particularly the case with our figure today. This is a figure that would resist any possible means of classification, would resist anything of saying, my thinking represents this category in opposition to other categories of thinking. He would, in part, or strongly, say he's really not part of any kind of a school. So again, when we call him a Taoist, we're putting him and giving him a label that he probably wouldn't have agreed with. Not necessarily the name, but simply a label, period. Let me say a few words about him, which will be quick because we actually don't know a lot about him. We have a ton of stories about him, and you're reading them. He tells lots of stories in his own book about himself. For reasons we'll get to momentarily, I wouldn't take them as being historical artifacts of things that really actually happened in the world. So this is a text probably put together 4th century BCE, roughly contemporary with and perhaps a bit later than the other ones we've been mentioning so far, just because he'll incorporate some of the figures we've mentioned in his stories, but we don't know a lot about him. That's good because I think he would be very happy about that fact. What he wants is to have a text that is going to change us. And that's what he's left us. And it will change you, and I think in some very intriguing ways. Let me begin by saying a few words about it. I realize since the papers were literally due at 10 a.m., you might not have yet read the Zhuangzi in depth as of now, so let me say a few words about what you will be facing. You will be facing one of the most exciting imaginative texts you have ever read, but it's a difficult text in an intriguing way. Note, if you go back at the text we've read, we began, of course, with the Analects, and part of the power of that text was an attempt to give you this figure, Confucius, working with his disciples, explaining what he did on a daily basis, what these rituals were he was following, how he would talk to disciples, and it was a portrait of someone trying to live his philosophy. And as we discussed, part of the power of the book was just giving you those vignettes, him saying something to a disciple, him acting in a certain way, portraying what it would mean to live a life as Confucius was calling on us to live. We noted this was true in a different way, somewhat more elaborate way with Mencius, where there too we have a text that will give you sort of portraits of Mencius as a human being, spending a life trying to be a good human being, trying to develop a philosophy and a way of thinking and a way of life that will affect others for the better, striving in a complex way, it's a complex portrait, to be a good person given the moral psychology he is developing. And again, part of the power of the book was to get you into him as a person given his philosophy. Versus something like the Mozi, which was, of course, an attempt to lay out clear arguments. Here are my criteria for argumentation, here are our standards, follow these standards, and you will be a proper, rational human being. And the text was largely shorn of the kind of exciting writing, anecdotes, intriguing stories that we get in the other texts. It was sort of what we would think of as a more straightforward philosophical analysis. This is what is good, here's how you define it, here are the standards of argumentation. And now we've seen two so-called Taoist texts that go about this in yet a different way, sort of a third way of writing a text. In this third one so far, we have no figures mentioned, unlike the Confucian texts. Certainly no rational standards of argumentation in texts like the Laozi or the Inward Training. Rather, what you get are these we actually don't tellingly have a good word for it in English, powerful phrases for the Laozi. The way that can be spoken of is not the enduring way. These very paradoxical phrases that ask you to work through them to understand the implications. In the Inward Training, these incredibly powerful lines trying to get you in the mode of thinking of the world in terms of these energies and your training that you can give through these energies. Again, no names mentioned, no anecdotes, simply trying to pull you in with the language of what it's trying to say. Now we have yet another one. Perhaps the most intriguing of them all, or certainly the most challenging of them all. What you're going to find is a text that is going to give you incredible numbers of stories, but they're wild stories. You don't get a portrait of what Zhuangzi did on a daily basis, or you get a portrait of Zhuangzi, but it's, you'll see, a rather wild one. Rather, what you get are wild anecdotes with these incredible fictional characters, including many animals, birds, fish, all these sorts of creatures, how the world seems from their perspective. Very, very humorous stories too, extremely funny, where he'll love to sort of like bring you down a path with a story and then give you this ludicrous and hysterical pun or this crucial twist, a sort of a surprise twist. He will talk about historical figures, but he'll have them spout rather odd things. Confucius will appear, talking to his disciples, saying some rather un-Confucian things. In other words, it's this incredibly imaginative text, wildly fictional, wildly imaginative. And, as with all of our texts, it's written this way to enact what it wants us to do. So one of our questions will be, what does it want us to do? Why is it written this way? Why is it such a challenging text? Because as we'll see, that will be a bit counterintuitive with what he's calling on us to do. And how should we understand the larger argument here? To begin with, let us, as always, pull back and give some general views about what he's up to, and then we'll get into the nitty-gritty. First, some general views. Since he's classified as a Taoist, you might imagine, and you'll quickly see when you begin reading, he does talk about this thing called the Way, very much as did Laozi. You also might notice he seems to be emphasizing rather different things about the Way. So why don't we just begin right there? What is the Way for Zhuangzi? First of all, a contrast. For Laozi, as we saw, the Way is, in a sense, everything. Everything in its absolutely undifferentiated state. So, again, cosmologically, that state from which the differentiated cosmos emerges, and to which someday it may return. On a more mundane level, that ground from which things grow, and to which they return. Grass grows, grass dies. It grows from the Way, it returns to the Way. Experientially, if we see the world differentially, the Way would be the degree to which we could experience the world as everything interrelated to everything else, in its stillness, in its emptiness, in its calmness. And if we can still ourselves, calm ourselves, empty ourselves, we get closer to that Way, closer to that ground. And as we noted, the verbs, therefore, are returning, right? You're going back, returning, holding fast to the Way. It's that basis, that ground from which the differentiated world emerges, and again, to which it will return. Note the different ways that the Way will be spoken about with Zhuangzi. In some ways similar, of course. It's everything, as we'll see, in its absolutely interrelated state. But the focus isn't so much on absolute undifferentiation. It's not so much the ground. It isn't even a verb of going back, holding fast to, returning to. Rather, think of the Way for Zhuangzi as absolutely everything in its constant flux and transformation. Everything for Zhuangzi is constantly in flux, constantly transforming into everything else. Everything is moving constantly and, as we will see, spontaneously. That for Zhuangzi is the Way. The seasons change, that's the Way. Sure, grass grows and grass dies, but also grass grows, interacts with everything else in the world. When it dies, the stuff that are the grass enter the soil, and that stuff grows into other things. Or before it dies, it might be eaten by, say, a bird. And then the stuff that was the grass become part of the bird, and a bear may eat the bird. And the stuff that was part of that bird may become part of the bear. And over time, everything is slowly becoming everything else. Over the millennia, literally all the stuff that is us and this and everything around us will slowly become part of everything else too. And if we could take a larger perspective, we would see a world of constant flux, constant transformation. And indeed, we would also see that everything in the world, with this we'll see a little exception, everything in the world is inherently a part of this. Everything is constantly, spontaneously becoming everything else, shifting in relationship to everything else, constant movement, constant relationships in a kind of endless movement and flux and shift. Everything is like this. When birds fly, that's what they're doing. They're flying around because they have these certain organs and they have these certain faculties and they have wings and they float around depending on the different shifting winds and the topography below them. They are spontaneously following the way. Fish, of course, swim around because they have gills and they have a tail and they shift around with the currents, moving around with the currents, which shift around them. They're following the way spontaneously. They don't think, okay, now I should turn this way because the current is going this way and then I'll turn that way. They just do it. They're fish. They're spontaneously part of the way. Everything is spontaneously a part of the way. Except I mentioned that one little exception. There is one thing in the world, in the whole cosmos as far as we can tell, that does not spontaneously follow the way. And I'm sorry to say, it's us. We alone seem to not do this. And we alone seem to not do it for a very interesting reason. You see, we have this organ called a mind. Now, Zhuangzi loves the mind. It's great. As we will see, it can allow you to do unbelievable things, not least of which is write these incredible stories and incredible poems and incredible books, and as we will see, do many, many, many more things as well. It's great to have a mind, just as it would be great to have wings and fly around and gills to swim through the oceans. It's great to have a mind, but we misuse it. The way we use our mind is something like if, say, a bird were using its wings to try to swim through the oceans. It's taking something that could be incredible with how it could flow with the cosmos, and instead using it to work against the cosmos, work against this endless flux and transformation. And hence, we as human beings are miserable because we're endlessly fighting against the way, endlessly trying to construct lives that fight against the way, endlessly trying to close ourselves off from this incredible endless flux and transformation, and endlessly, by battling against the way, slowly destroying ourselves. And the result of this is clear, because we will be miserable, we will spend our lives fighting against the way, and we will lose. And we will pass away, and we will join the rest of the cosmos, but having lived a life fighting against something that instead could have been unbelievably energizing and inspiring. And so the key for Zhuangzi, the reason he writes this text, is to open us up, to teach us how to use our mind in this exciting way that allows us to become one again with the way, to connect with the way and become, he will argue, an unbelievable, extraordinary human being during this brief time when the stuff of us happens to be in the form of a human being. We're capable of incredible things, and we cut ourselves off from them. Now, from this way of putting it, you might think, well, at least here we've got a pretty clear-cut way of getting there, right? I mean, we saw with the Lao-Tzu, it's a tough text and tough to get there. Here you might think, well, okay, here it's pretty clear what happens, right? The problem is everything in the world is spontaneously part of the flux and transformation of the way, and if we humans are not, like we're not spontaneously part of the flux and transformation of the way because we have this mind that creates these problems, then clearly the solution is painfully obvious, right? Right? I mean, if the mind is cutting us off, what is it doing? And sure enough, he will say all that I'm about to say. It cuts us off in the following ways. It cuts us off because we try to control this flux and transformation, and we can't. We try to say, okay, I will have a clear plan for my life, and I will do the following, and that will be my goal, and I will direct everything to that goal, which makes perfect sense, except of course, from this point of view, you set the goal, you direct everything to it, you're closing your mind off from this unbelievable flux and transformation. All the things that could be exciting you and energizing you, you restrict yourself from. In fact, you literally begin forming blinders to prevent them from pulling you away from your plan. And slowly but surely, you destroy yourself. Or you try to find stable things in this world of flux and transformation. You try to say, okay, well, one thing I can be sure about is me, right? There's me, I know who I am, I'll look inside, find my true self, and that's just me. No, because for Zhuangzi, you're reifying yourself. You're taking this current set of stuff that's you and saying, this is me. Well, it's you right now, but it's not what you necessarily need to be in 20, 30 years if you're opening yourself up to this constant flux and transformation and allowing yourself to be inspired and moved and created by it. How else do we do it? We try to create stable foundations for thinking. This is right, that is wrong. Well, even if at best at this particular moment that's accurate, and that may not be, but even if it is, here again, create them as stable categories, I'll direct my life accordingly, well then, no. Because you've restricted yourself. You've cut yourself off from the flux and transformation. In other words, all the ways that we act in the world, all the ways that we direct our lives, all the ways that we think about ourselves are foolish attempts to create stable things, ourselves, goals, clear-cut ways of being in the world that actually, ironically and counterintuitively, are destroying ourselves. And then again, you might think, okay, but again, at least it's clear what we do. So we stop doing this and become spontaneous, right? If everything is spontaneously part of the way, and we are using our mind to restrict ourselves, then we just stop doing it, and we become spontaneous. So I could, like, for example, jump on top of here and dance if I felt like doing that, and that would be really spontaneous. And that would mean I'm part of the way, right? No. Don't worry, I'm not going to do it. And the reason I'm not going to do it is because I've read the Zhuangzi. That is not for him spontaneity. It is not simply spontaneous to do, okay, right now I'll do whatever I want to do. Because whatever I want to do would probably be based upon, again, all of the things that we were just talking about. It would be based upon this world that we've created for ourselves, and what we think of as spontaneity is kind of the opposite of what we usually do. Right? So, okay, normally I would try to give you a good lecture, and I'm sure often failing, but then to be spontaneous, I jump on here and dance. But again, that's simply the same thing as what I'm trying to otherwise do. I'm simply jumping on a table and dancing. That's not spontaneity. That's simply trying to do immediately the opposite of what I usually try to do. In itself, that is not good for Zhuangzi, to say the least. That's not spontaneity. Spontaneity actually requires altering the way we think, altering the way we act in the world, and opening ourselves up to this endless flux and transformation, which will mean things that we could not yet imagine. It doesn't simply mean doing the opposite, the fun thing of what we normally do. In other words, it doesn't simply mean, okay, during my weekdays I will then have my plan, and on weekends I'll do something fun. That's all fine and good, but that fun stuff for Zhuangzi would not be where you're going to find your spontaneity. It's simply the way to relax based upon doing sort of the opposite of what you usually spend your life doing. So it turns out it's really complicated. Yes, you're supposed to become spontaneous and spontaneously one with this endless flux and transformation, but it's really difficult to do. It takes a lot of work, it turns out, a lot of effort. And since, again, goal-directed effort is what tends to get us into trouble, it takes a lot of work to understand the work that Zhuangzi is talking about. So, as always, why don't we simply look at one of his stories to try to get us into his way of thinking. And the one I'll pick to begin with is the one about a butcher. A butcher. So that's what he is. He's a butcher, right? And so his life consists of taking big things of meat, and he's got, of course, his big knife, and he just like stabs away at the meat. Because meat is like, it's got all these tendons and muscles and bones and things. You got to sort of dig through it. So he's got this big knife, and he sort of digs through it to cut out the slabs of meat. And this is his life. Just cut, slab of meat, and putting out the slab of meat. So it's a kind of tough job. It's sort of like, most of us have tough jobs because we're having to like work against things. In this case, working against all the tough stuff of the meat. So that's what he does. But then over time, he begins to notice that instead of simply having to take his knife and cut and try to work against all of these different muscles and bones and things in the meat, he begins to notice that actually in the meat itself, there are all of these sort of flowing patterns. For example, there are all of these muscles and bones, but actually what there really are like, here's a bone, and then there's the way the kind of muscle wraps around the bone and the way the tendon wraps around the muscle. And at any given moment in the sort of the meat in front of you, there are all of these lines and patterns in it. And if instead of simply trying to hack through the meat with the knife, using all of his strength, the butcher begins to notice that with training, this is not easy, he can begin to sort of sense where these actual flows and patterns in the meat are. And to do this, he doesn't think too much with his mind, thinking through, okay, well, the last piece of meat, of course, there was like a place here where I could cut through easily, and so, with this new piece of meat, I'll cut in that same place. What he does, therefore, is using his spirit, he is beginning to sense the different fluctuations in the meat. So that what he starts doing is simply picking up his knife, and with the knife, simply sensing with that spirit where these patterns are, and flowing the knife through the patterns in the meat, each meat, of course, being different. So he's sensing it. And once he gets to the point where he can truly sense this, he gets to the point where he can simply pick up his knife, slide it through the meat, perfectly and, yes, spontaneously, to the point where he never has to sharpen his blade. The butcher has understood it. Now, let's take apart the story, because typically Zhuangzi ends the story there. What is he saying? Well, first note what he's not saying. Note, if this is how we achieve spontaneity, note, to begin with, spontaneity does not mean the butcher throws down his knife and dances on the floor, or dances on the table, as the case may be. No. It also doesn't mean he simply stops doing whatever he's doing and can suddenly become spontaneous in any sense of the word. It also doesn't mean he says, okay, well, I'd have to cut through these slabs of meat during the week, but on weekends, then I can dance on my table and be spontaneous. No. He actually achieves it through this seemingly daily mundane activity of, in his case, hacking through pieces of meat. Note also, he doesn't achieve it by cease being a butcher. That could well be. We'll see later stories where that could well be the case. But in itself, the key here is not reject anything you're doing in the world in order to become spontaneous. On the contrary, there's nothing inherently wrong about being in society and having social duties and having jobs. Zhuangzi has no problem with that, per se. We'll see, he wants it to be something that will excite you, but per se, that's not the problem. You don't need to, again, dance off in the woods and reject what you do in the weekdays to gain spontaneity. So what is the butcher doing? Well, clearly Zhuangzi means the story analogically. We're not, all of us, going to be butchers, and some of us may be vegetarians. We might not even ever cut up a piece of meat anyway. That's not the point. Clearly what he means by the butcher and his piece of meat is the way we live our lives. The way we live our lives is the equivalent of the poor butcher, before he started doing this, hacking through the meat. Think of your life this way. What your life consists of, from this perspective, is simply trying to hack through life, right? There are all of these complex patterns out there that we ignore because we set this idea, I'm going to cut this meat in the slabs this way, and that's how I'm going to live my life. Or, putting it analogically, slab, slab, slab. This is the way I'll do it, according to this certain definition of how big the slab should be. and you're hacking and hacking and hacking. That's how we live our lives, ignoring the patterns, driving ourselves through our lives, closing ourselves off to all else that's going on. And the way you become spontaneous is you, counterintuitively enough, train yourself to be spontaneous. In this case, sticking to our analogical story, you train yourself to be able to sense the patterns out there. Because there are differences in the world, right? The pieces of meat, there are differences, these patterns. And what he's doing when he's sliding through these patterns is he is learning how to spontaneously feel the patterns, moving through the world spontaneously, or in this case analogically, with his knife spontaneously through the meat, such that he's no longer hacking against it. But also note, spontaneously moving through the world does not mean simply accepting the world as given, because, again, I'm pushing this analogy, but I think this is part of the implication, the meat does change. I mean, he literally cuts up the meat, and it becomes something different. So spontaneity is a training act where you are using your spirit, seeing, sensing the different patterns around you, working with those patterns, but in a way that, as we will see, will change things. And note the key part of the story as to what's changing. When he's doing this, he becomes, ironically, but I think this is part of the intriguing power of a Zhuangzi story, more alive, because he's able to sense things so well. And indeed, the story concludes precisely with the ruler seeing this, saying, yes, now I understand life, because he becomes alive through this training exercise. Now, before we finish our discussion of this story, let me immediately give two more, and then work out the implications. These two other ones I will intentionally draw from modern examples, things we do in our lives, to give you a sense of the kind of experience he's talking about, but then we'll return to the butcher and note how different it is. But first, let's try to think of a couple of examples from our lives where we seem to get the sort of thing that Zhuangzi is talking about. In other words, we train ourselves to spontaneously become somehow more alive by sensing things better with what he's calling our spirit. That may sound like a very, very abstract way of putting it, but it's not. We have all done the equivalent of this. Think, for example, if you've ever learned a musical instrument. We'll take piano as an example. How do you learn a piano? Do you simply sit down at the piano and spontaneously play? Well, you can, and it will be painful to you and everyone around you, and I'm sure your parents would have slammed the door shut and saying, please stop. That is not how you learn a piano. You learn a piano by spending years, sitting at the piano, at first doing the rote chord progressions, boom, 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 boom. Slowly, years go by, you learn more and more about how to play the notes, you're training your fingers to move through the notes, training your fingers to be able to hit these keys, and the years go by, you're training beyond that. You're training to be able to sense a piece of music, you see it in front of you, you're playing the piece of music, but slowly but surely, you're not simply doing the standard progressions that you're reading, you're sensing the music, right? You're sensing the music, you're sort of playing with the music. Over time, you get to a point where you begin to really, truly resonate with the music, to the point where you even can perform. And when you're performing for people around you, you're kind of sensing the room, sensing how to play to affect the room. You may play in a certain way because there's sort of a calm mood in the room, or an anxious mood. You may play more calmly to make it less anxious. You may sort of play a little more strongly to sort of build up energy in the room. And you'll play it in slightly different ways, sensing the room around you, playing in ways that open up that room in various ways, all of which you're sensing. You're not thinking. At no point are you thinking, okay, I'll play a little harder now, a little softer now, I better hit this chord progression. No, when you get this, you get a point where you're simply sensing it and resonating with it. It takes you years of rote training, but slowly through that rote training, you get to the point where, now shifting our terminology, you spontaneously can resonate, spontaneously sense the room, and spontaneously do this craft in a way that alters the room dramatically. When you do that, Note how you feel. It's this incredible just rush of excitement because you're sensing things so well. Your senses are alive, you're sensing things, you're playing in a way that brings out everyone else, and there's this incredible sense of just the moment where you feel, to use a kind of Americanism, there, fully present in that moment. That, I think, is precisely the experience he's talking about. One other quick example before we get to the point. If you haven't learned an instrument, think about playing a sport. Okay? Basketball we'll choose. Same thing, right? Basketball, you begin playing. It's kind of awkward to like bounce a ball and throw it at a basket if you remember what it was like when you were a child. But slowly, like you again spend tons of rote work learning to throw the basketball over and over and over again. And eventually you hit a point, as the years go by, where you begin to really be able to sense in a situation where you are in the court, how to jump, how to move, precisely your fingers at just the right moment so you can avoid your opponent and put it in. And there are those moments, we even have a term for it in English, when you're in the zone, when all of that training sort of comes together and you're able to, for whatever else is stressing you out, going into the game, whatever else is going on, you hit the game, you suddenly hit this higher plane where you're able to sense perfectly the ball around you, the mood of your opponents, how to move the ball. You start hitting the ball every single time right into the hoop. Again, we call it in the zone, that just moment when you sense things so incredibly well. You sense how to move the ball, how to shift away from your opponents, where to go with the ball. And when you're in that zone, note, the coach will always tell you during those timeouts, don't think, just keep doing it, keep doing it. Because if you think, oh yeah, the way I'm in the zone is because I'm jumping up and I'm moving my fingers in a certain way, and I'm worried about this guard over here, so I'm moving in a certain way. As soon as you think that, you've lost it. You're no longer in the zone, you're gonna miss every single basket. Your coach will always say, don't think, keep playing, don't think. In other words, don't use your mind, don't try to actually stabilize this, come up with some clear explanation of what's going on. Sense it with your spirit because you can after this years of training, now that you're spontaneously sensing it. Both of those examples, basketball, piano, you're training yourself to become spontaneous. Feeling, once you've attained it, that incredible rush of excitement, resonance with everything around you, that incredible rush, again, shifting into our terminology here, of the flux and transformation of the way that you're now fully a part of, but notice, engaged in. You're not simply passively following these patterns, you're part of these endless shifting patterns. You're changing the room with the way you play the piano. You're literally changing the pace of the game, to put it mildly, by the way you're playing in the zone. You are actively engaged and becoming energized and alive and vibrant by being in the way. But notice immediately the contrast of those stories with our butcher. Because both of those examples, unless you're going to become, say, a professional basketball player or a professional concert pianist, or even if you are, the same point would hold, they're things we do in restricted moments of our life. For most of us, these are the things we do on weekends, right? During the weekdays is when we do the normal work we are doing, and then we do the stuff like this on weekends sort of to relax and have fun. So for fun, we'll play basketball or play the piano because we do, if we've been doing it for enough years, you get that rush of excitement. And it's a fun thing to do on the weekends. And then you go back to your mundane daily life. Or if you're a concert pianist or professional basketball player, yes, you're doing it in the weekdays, but you probably have something else then to do to relax on the weekends. Note our butcher. Our butcher doesn't just do this on the weekends for fun, away from his normal everyday life. He's a butcher. This is what he does. In other words, I think what Zhuangzi is getting at with his story is to say, that is what you should be aiming at. We all know the sort of thing he's talking about. Again, we've experienced it. Basketball, piano, or whatever equivalent. We've done things like what Zhuangzi is talking about. But what I suspect none of us have done, precisely because it's so difficult and cuts against the way we live our lives, is through our mundane, daily, everyday lives, being like the butcher, through the daily rote stuff we do on a daily basis, what if you're doing, as you do those, precisely what you were doing on those weekends when you're learning the piano or playing basketball? You are training yourself in precisely the same way, but it's more difficult because you're not just training your fingers, as with a piano, and ultimately your senses, you're training everything. You are training your way of being in the world. Imagine, to give some intentionally ludicrous examples, but he would say these aren't ludicrous if you're really doing it, imagine if you're reaching a point where, through the daily stuff you're doing every day, including walking through a grocery store and buying groceries, that very act can become incredibly exciting. There are things that will excite you. You're opening yourself up to the exciting things of that. In other words, all the drab stuff we have to do, imagine if you did them the way the butcher, instead of hacking his way through the meat, is able to do. Imagine through your daily, everyday life, you are training yourself to once again become spontaneous, training yourself to once again be excited and resonating with the world around you, training yourself to sense things, and with your spirit, be part of this endless flux and transformation of the way. And if you're doing that, then, of course, you don't have yet another artificial distinction of daily stuff and fun stuff on weekends. Then your whole life becomes this. Your whole life becomes a training exercise to achieve this spontaneous, just sort of enraptured presence in and active engagement with everything around you. And if you're doing that, what do you achieve? Well, for Zhuangzi, absolutely everything. Because if you're doing that, then you are becoming a radically different type of human being. If you say, I am just the sort of person who is X, I just am this certain person, I can't do certain things, don't think that way. Train yourself to be involved in the world. Note how the certain sorts of things will intensely excite you and inspire you. Work on those, develop those, open yourself up to those, and you will find over time it will be stunning the different type of a human being you slowly become. It will be incredible how these seemingly mundane activities can become incredibly exciting. You also, of course, begin to sense, in terms of future career options, etc., what sorts of things really, really excite you. And if you think you can't do them because you're not good enough, well, no, that's because you're claiming, I'm the sort of person who can't do this. If you don't think that way, notice, in practice, over time, how dramatically different of type of human being you can become. In other words, what Zhuangzi is saying is, think of your life as this daily training to become spontaneous. Spontaneous meaning fully, totally, absolutely in accord with the endless flux and transformation of the way. Now note, by putting it that way, there actually is someone who actually sounds in some very counterintuitive ways a lot like this. And not necessarily Lao-Tzu, although there are lots of parallels with Lao-Tzu, but perhaps the one, at least in this regard, focusing on the daily mundane stuff we do to train ourselves, ironically, it sounds a lot like Confucius, doesn't it? Note how incredibly similar this is to Confucius. Where Confucius, it's, of course, different terminology, crucial as we'll see, but nonetheless, through these daily ritual works, training yourself through the mundane rituals to transform yourself into a radically different type of human being. And this, I think, is precisely why Zhuangzi loves to give these stories about Confucius. Because I think he feels Confucius is onto something exactly like he wants to develop, and yet he clearly wants to make a critique of Confucius, and this is something we should take seriously. I think what he's saying about Confucius, or maybe about what Confucianism could potentially be read as being, in other words, the ways that vision in the Analects can be interpreted, is if you read it that way, if you read, in other words, the Analects as there are rituals out there that if we think of them as the means to achieve goodness as opposed to lack of goodness, we will slowly become better people. The danger of that, I think he's saying, Zhuangzi, is, well, be careful, because even though I don't think this is the portrait you're getting in the Analects, the danger is if you think of that as, okay, there are clear steps I need to take by doing these rituals to get at a clear goal, namely goodness, which is opposed to something else, it becomes too much of a clear path that can close you off from the way. Now, as we discussed with the Analects, I don't think that's quite what Confucius is saying. For Confucius, rituals are this daily stuff we're doing, and that can mean any of these daily things we're involved with. And goodness, as we saw, is about as amorphous a term as it could possibly be. He literally can't define it, or will define it radically different every time he talks to any disciple. So I think Confucius himself was actively trying not to fall into a trap of giving you too clear a guide. But this, I think, is what Zhuangzi is getting at too, which is to say, quite apart from what Confucius was portrayed as doing in the Analects, at least the danger is he could be read as giving you too clear a path. And I think this is why Zhuangzi loves to give you these endless stories about Confucius and his disciples, where instead of talking about ritual and goodness, he's talking about all of this, spouting Zhuangzian thought. And I think what he's trying to get there is to say, if you really want what Confucius is saying you can achieve, this is the way to do it. This is how you actually can achieve this through your daily work. All of which, of course, raises for us an intriguing issue. If these thinkers are onto something, and again, given that we know what they're talking about, piano, basketball, I mean, we've had these experiences, and given at least the, I think, conceivably powerful argument that we could be doing this in our daily lives, I think what they were doing here, and the power it's bringing to us, is to think through what are the implications of thinking about it as ritual and goodness, and that complex interplay we saw with Confucius, or this incredibly intriguing vision, on the other hand, possibly, of spontaneity and the way, and this radically different terminology we'll get with the Zhuangzi. And it's helpful to think through how radically different are these? Intriguingly enough, of course, because both would say, if we think of them as too much of a dichotomy, then we're going to fall into a dangerous trap. So let me simply conclude with the following point. As always, I will ask you to put this into place, to begin to get a feel for what these figures are talking about. In this case, do a little bit of what Zhuangzi is saying. In other words, take what you have done, piano, basketball, anything like this, learning a skill-based activity over years, and begin doing that. And obviously, briefly, we're talking about days, not years, but begin doing it in your daily life, your mundane life. Begin trying the same kind of thing you were doing when you were training yourself in that skill activity. Begin trying to do it in the sense of, you're walking through campus. Note, sort of, we're anxious, we're stressed, I'm thinking about this, thinking about that. Self-consciously begin shifting your mind, allowing your spirit to sense things more. Note the exciting things out there. Begin to get a sense of what excites you. Begin to do a little bit more of what excites you, opening yourself up to what this text would call the patterns that are out there. Begin to sense how you begin to live your life a little bit differently, and then do it a little bit more.